The sound of rushing water echoing across my 15-acre ranch should have been peaceful, but watching Karen's manicured backyard slowly disappear under 6 inches of muddy runoff while she screamed at me from her flooded patio made it absolutely symphonic. 3 months earlier, she'd called my property a dust bowl that's ruining property values. Now she was discovering exactly what happens when you mess with a hydrologist who spent 20 years designing water management systems for cities. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 2 years ago, I bought my dream retirement property in Pine Valley Estates, 15 acres of rolling hills and natural grassland on the outskirts of a growing suburban community. The realtor called it rural charm with city convenience, and he wasn't wrong. My ranch sat on a gentle slope overlooking a creek valley with native prairie grass, scattered oak trees, and enough space for the horses I'd always wanted to own. The property wasn't manicured like the newer subdivisions springing up around it. It was wild, natural, exactly what I'd worked 30 years in municipal engineering to afford. After decades of designing storm drains and flood controls for concrete jungles, I craved open space where I could let the land be itself. My nearest neighbor was a half-mile away through a stand of mesquite trees, which gave me the privacy I dreamed of. Or so I thought. Karen Whitfield moved in 6 months later. She bought the 5-acre lot directly downhill from my property and immediately began construction on what can only be described as a suburban fortress. 7,000 square feet of Mediterranean-style excess, complete with formal gardens, a circular driveway, and lawn so perfectly green it looked like astroturf from my kitchen window. The contrast was jarring. My natural grassland, flowing down the hillside like a golden river, ending abruptly at her property line, where chemically enhanced perfection began. But I didn't mind the difference. Live and let live, right? Karen had other ideas. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late August. I was feeding my 2 horses Ranger, a paint gelding, and Belle, a quarter horse mare, when I noticed a woman marching up my gravel driveway with the determined stride of someone who'd already won an argument in her head. She was about 50, with shoulder-length blonde hair that looked professionally maintained and expensive athletic wear that had clearly never seen actual athletics. Her face had the tight, artificial smoothness that comes from regular cosmetic procedures, and her lips were pursed in permanent disapproval. "Are you the owner of this property?" she called out, not bothering with pleasantries like hello or introducing herself. I set down the feed bucket and walked over to my fence line. "I am Tom Bradley." I extended my hand over the rails. "You must be my new neighbor." She ignored the handshake. "Karen Whitfield. I live downhill from this." She gestured at my property like she was pointing at a crime scene. "This?" I looked around at my golden grassland, dotted with wildflowers and gently rolling in the morning breeze. "You mean my ranch? If that's what you want to call it." Her voice carried the particular tone that wealthy people use when they're pretending to be reasonable while insulting you. "I call it a dust bowl that's destroying property values for everyone in the area." The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. "Dust bowl? Karen, this is native prairie grass. It's been here longer than both of us combined. Native or not, it's an eyesore. And worse, it's affecting my property." She pointed toward her house, visible through the trees with its pristine landscaping and gleaming windows. "Every time the wind blows, I get dust and debris all over my gardens and pool area." I followed her gaze down the hillside. Her property was indeed immaculate, not a blade of grass out of place, not a single leaf allowed to remain on her perfect concrete surfaces. It was like a museum display of suburban wealth. "Karen, prairie grass prevents erosion. It actually holds the soil better than—" I don't need a lecture on landscaping from someone who clearly doesn't understand property maintenance. Her interruption was sharp enough to make my horses look up from their hay. What I need is for you to do something about this mess before it gets worse. Gets worse how? Fall is coming. All of that dead grass is going to blow all over my property. And don't get me started on fire hazards. She crossed her arms. I've done some research on community standards and property maintenance codes. The threat was subtle but clear. Research meant she'd been looking for legal ways to force me to change my land. Karen, I appreciate your concerns, but this is private property. I'm not violating any codes, and I have no intention of destroying native grassland to satisfy your aesthetic preferences. Her perfectly composed expression cracked slightly, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. We'll see about that, Mr. Bradley. Pine Valley Estates is a quality community, and some of us intend to keep it that way. She turned and marched back down my driveway, her athletic shoes crunching on gravel like an army in retreat. I watched her go, noting how she stopped at the property line to take photos of my land with her phone. That evening, I found a letter in my mailbox from the Pine Valley HOA citing a complaint about unmaintained vegetation creating community hazards. But what I didn't know was that Karen had already scheduled a meeting with the county commissioner to discuss agricultural zoning violations. I spent the next morning at the county planning office, a beige building that smelled like industrial coffee and bureaucratic frustration. The clerk, a patient woman named Rosa, who looked like she'd spent decades explaining zoning laws to angry residents, pulled up my property records on her computer. 15 acres, zoned agricultural with residential allowance, she confirmed. No restrictions on native vegetation, no requirements for landscaping maintenance. You're in compliance with all county codes. What about HOA authority? Can they force property modifications? Rosa shook her head. HOAs can only enforce rules that don't conflict with county zoning. Agricultural property has different standards than residential subdivisions. I left the planning office feeling confident about my legal position, but concerned about Karen's determination. In my engineering career, I'd learned that the most dangerous opponents aren't the ones with the best arguments, they're the ones who won't stop arguing. That afternoon, I decided to do some research of my own. Karen Whitfield wasn't hard to investigate. A quick internet search revealed her background. Former marketing executive, divorced twice, member of multiple homeowners associations and community boards. Most tellingly, she'd been involved in property disputes in 2 previous neighborhoods. The pattern was clear. Karen moved somewhere, decided she didn't like something about her surroundings, then launched campaigns to force changes. In her previous location, she'd successfully lobbied to ban vegetable gardens in front yards. Before that, she'd led a campaign against a neighbor's chicken coop. My prairie grass was just her latest target. Wednesday brought new complications. I was repairing a section of fence near the property line when I heard the distinctive rumble of heavy machinery. Through the trees, I could see a landscaping crew at Karen's house, not doing maintenance, but installing something large and expensive. By evening, the mystery was solved. Karen had installed a $15,000 outdoor air filtration system, complete with industrial fans and HEPA filters, positioned to face directly toward my property. The message was clear. She was literally trying to filter out my ranch. But what I didn't realize was that Karen's air filtration system was just the opening move in a much larger strategy. Thursday morning brought the knock I'd been dreading. A county inspector stood on my porch, clipboard in hand, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Tom Bradley? I'm Mike Santos, Code Enforcement. I need to inspect your property based on a complaint about potential health and safety violations. I invited him in for coffee and spent the next hour walking my land with him. Mike was a reasonable guy who clearly knew the difference between actual violations and neighbor disputes. Your property is in perfect compliance, he told me as we finished the tour. Prairie grass, native landscaping, proper setbacks, no structural issues. Whoever filed this complaint is wasting everyone's time. Can you tell me what specific violations were alleged? Mike checked his clipboard. Fire hazard from unmaintained vegetation, dust pollution affecting neighboring properties, potential breeding ground for pests and vermin, and, he paused, looking embarrassed, aesthetic degradation of community standards. Aesthetic degradation? That's not a real code violation, Mike said quickly. But the complaint was very detailed. Photos, measurements, even air quality readings, taken from the complainant's property. Karen had been busy. The photos and air quality readings showed she was building a case, not just making complaints. What happens now? I asked. I file a report stating no violations found, case closed. Mike shook his head. But Mr. Bradley? Whoever filed this complaint isn't going to stop here. People who go to this much trouble usually have lawyers next. That evening, as if Mike had prophetic powers, I found an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a letter from Whitfield & Associates Legal Services. Apparently Karen had her own legal consultation business. The letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation disguised as neighborly concern. Dear Mr. Bradley, as discussed, the current state of your property presents ongoing concerns for community health, safety, and property values. While we appreciate your attachment to natural landscaping, we must consider the broader impact on Pine Valley Estates. We are prepared to offer reasonable solutions, including cost-sharing for professional landscaping services, that would address community concerns while maintaining your privacy preferences. Please contact our office within 10 business days to discuss mutually beneficial arrangements. If no response is received, we will be forced to explore other remedies available under county environmental and community standards codes. Respectfully, K. Whitfield, Community Standards Advocate. Community Standards Advocate. Karen had given herself an official-sounding title and was offering to pay for landscaping that would destroy my prairie grass. When I didn't respond within her 10-day deadline, Karen's next move shocked even me. But what I discovered about her cost-sharing offer would make me realize this was never about dust or property values. 2 weeks after ignoring Karen's legal letter, I woke up to find surveyor's flags planted all along my property line. Bright orange plastic markers dotted the fence between my ranch and Karen's pristine landscaping, each one placed with mathematical precision. I called the surveying company whose name was printed on the flags. The receptionist was helpful but confused. Those are boundary verification markers, she explained. Someone ordered a complete property line survey for, let me see, 1247 Pine Valley Road. That was Karen's address. Did they say why they needed a boundary survey? The order just says encroachment investigation. Pretty standard for property disputes. Encroachment investigation. Karen was looking for evidence that I'd somehow crossed onto her property, probably hoping to find legal grounds for forcing changes to my land use. I hung up and walked the fence line, examining each surveyor's flag. They were placed exactly on the legal boundary. My research at the county office had been thorough. But as I reached the southwest corner of my property, I noticed something interesting. Karen's perfect lawn extended about 3 feet onto my side of the property line. Her irrigation system, an expensive setup of underground sprinklers and drip lines, crossed the boundary in 2 places, watering my land without permission. Most interesting of all, the concrete pad supporting her new air filtration system sat partially on my property. Karen's encroachment investigation had backfired spectacularly. While she was looking for violations on my part, she documented her own illegal use of my land. I took photos of every encroachment, then called my own surveyor to get official documentation. By Friday afternoon, I had legal proof that Karen's property improvements violated county setback requirements and trespassed on my land. But instead of confronting her immediately, I decided to let her make the next move. In my engineering career, I'd learned that the best solutions often come from understanding your opponent's real motivations. Karen's motivations became crystal clear on Saturday morning, when I discovered what her mutually beneficial arrangements actually meant. Saturday brought visitors, not Karen this time, but 3 people in business suits carrying clipboards and measuring equipment. I watched from my kitchen window as they walked my property line, taking notes and photographs. When they approached my house, the lead man introduced himself as Craig Morrison from Desert Vista Development. "Mr. Bradley, we understand you might be interested in selling your property. We're prepared to make a very competitive offer." The pieces clicked into place. "Let me guess, Karen Whitfield suggested you contact me?" Craig's smile was practiced, but not quite genuine. "Mrs. Whitfield mentioned that you might be looking to downsize, given the maintenance challenges of such a large property." Maintenance challenges? Well, 15 acres is a lot of responsibility, especially with neighbors who have concerns about land management. I invited Craig and his associates to my kitchen table, curious to hear their pitch. Desert Vista Development specialized in luxury rural subdivisions, taking large properties and breaking them into smaller lots for expensive homes. "We could offer $3.2 million for your 15 acres, Craig said, sliding a folder across the table. "That's well above market value, considering the current condition of the land." The offer was generous, too generous. I flipped through the development plans, noting how they'd subdivided my property into 8 luxury lots, each one positioned to maximize views of the valley. "These are detailed plans," I observed. "How long have you been working on this project?" Craig's smile faltered slightly. "We like to be prepared for opportunities." "Opportunities that Mrs. Whitfield brought to your attention?" "We've had preliminary discussions with several community members about development potential in Pine Valley Estates." Translation: Karen had been shopping my property to developers before she ever knocked on my door. Her complaints about dust and property values weren't about aesthetics, they were about eliminating obstacles to a development deal. "What's Mrs. Whitfield's role in this potential development?" I asked. Craig exchanged glances with his associates. "She's expressed interest in serving as a community liaison, helping ensure that any new development maintains the high standards that Pine Valley Estates is known for." Community liaison. Karen had positioned herself to profit from forcing me to sell my land. "Gentlemen," I said, standing up and collecting their folder, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in selling. I love my ranch exactly the way it is." Craig's professional demeanor slipped. "Mr. Bradley, I should mention that maintaining large properties can become complicated when there are community concerns about land use. Sometimes it's easier to work with the neighborhood than fight against it." "Is that a threat?" "It's friendly advice. Mrs. Whitfield has mentioned that there might be ongoing code enforcement issues if the property maintenance situation doesn't improve." I showed them to the door, my anger building with each step. Karen wasn't just a difficult neighbor, she was running a scam, using HOA complaints and code enforcement threats to force property sales that would benefit her financially. But as Craig's car disappeared down my driveway, I realized Karen had made a critical mistake in her research. She'd assumed I was just another retiree who could be bullied into submission. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 2 decades designing flood control systems, and I'd been studying the topography of our properties since the day I moved in. That weekend, I drove to the State Water Resources office in the capital, a 3-hour trip through countryside that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with rural living. The water rights clerk, an older gentleman named Frank, who'd worked in water law for 40 years, helped me research the hydrology of Pine Valley. "Interesting property you've got there," Frank said, spreading topographical maps across his desk. "Your land sits on what we call a natural water collection zone. All the runoff from the hills above you flows through your property before it reaches the creek. He traced his finger along the contour lines on the map. See how the elevation drops? Your neighbor downhill, that would be the Whitfield property, is in what we technically call a natural floodplain. Nothing dangerous under normal conditions, but if there was ever increased water flow from uphill. What kind of increased water flow? Frank pulled out another map showing water rights and usage permits. Well, as the uphill property owner, you have natural runoff rights. That means you can collect, divert, and use any water that naturally flows across your land, even if it affects downhill properties. As long as you're not artificially creating hazardous conditions, you can manage water flow however you want on your own property. Frank smiled. It's an old law, dates back to agricultural water rights from the 1800s. Most people don't know about it. I spent another hour studying the maps and water flow patterns. Karen's property sat in a natural depression that had historically been a seasonal wetland before development. During heavy rains, water would naturally collect in that area before slowly draining toward the creek. The previous owner of Karen's lot had installed extensive drainage systems to keep the area dry, expensive French drains, storm sewers, and pumps that diverted water around the natural collection zone. But according to Frank, if those artificial drainage systems were ever to fail or become overwhelmed, the water would simply return to its natural flow pattern. Hypothetically, I asked, what would happen if someone built a water feature on the uphill property? Something that increased the natural water flow? Frank consulted his charts. Like a pond or fountain? That would be considered agricultural water management, perfectly legal, as long as it uses natural runoff. Might change the drainage patterns downhill, but that's nature for you. I drove home with a new understanding of the landscape and a plan that would solve my Karen problem permanently. But first, I needed to document exactly how far her harassment was willing to go. Monday brought a certified letter that made Karen's previous correspondence look friendly. This time, she'd hired a real attorney, not her own questionable legal services business, but a legitimate law firm specializing in property disputes. Davidson, Klein and Associates, attorneys at law. Mr. Bradley, we represent Karen Whitfield regarding ongoing property maintenance issues affecting Pine Valley Estates. Despite multiple attempts at neighborly resolution, the current state of your property continues to create health, safety, and environmental hazards for surrounding residents. Our client has documented extensive damage to her property resulting from dust, debris, and particulate matter originating from unmaintained vegetation on your land. Additionally, the presence of uncontrolled native grasses presents significant fire hazards during dry seasons. We hereby demand the following remedial actions be completed within 30 days. 1. Professional landscape management to eliminate dust-generating vegetation. 2. Installation of appropriate ground cover to prevent soil erosion. 3. Removal of all dead or dying plant matter that could contribute to fire hazards. 4. Compensation for documented property damage in the amount of $12,000. Failure to comply will result in legal action seeking injunctive relief, monetary damages, and attorney's fees. We await your immediate attention to this matter. $12,000 in damages for dust on her patio. The demand was outrageous enough to be insulting, but the legal letterhead made it a credible threat. I called my own attorney, Jim Rodriguez, who'd handled my property purchase and estate planning. Jim was a straight-talking guy who'd grown up on a ranch and understood rural property rights. Tom, this is harassment disguised as legal action, he said after reviewing the letter. No judge is going to order you to destroy native grassland because your neighbor doesn't like dust. Can she actually sue for property damage? She can sue for anything, but proving damages from natural dust and debris? That's a tough case. Jim paused. The concerning part is the fire hazard claim. If she can convince code enforcement that your property presents a legitimate fire risk, they might have authority to require mitigation. Even though the property is zoned agricultural, fire safety supersedes zoning in most cases. And if she's got a real law firm involved, she's serious about pushing this. That afternoon, I walked my property with a new perspective. The prairie grass was entering its late summer dormancy, taking on the golden brown color that Karen had described as dead and dying. To her suburban eyes, it probably did look neglected. But to anyone who understood natural ecosystems, it was simply seasonal change. The deep root systems were alive and healthy. The dormant grass would green up with fall rains, and the entire prairie was functioning exactly as it had for thousands of years. Karen's problem wasn't with my land management, it was with nature itself. As I reached the highest point of my property, overlooking both the valley and Karen's house below, an idea began forming. If Karen wanted to wage legal war over natural processes, I'd give her a masterclass in natural hydrology. But I didn't realize that Karen had one more escalation planned that would force my hand immediately. Wednesday morning, I woke up to sirens. 3 fire trucks and 2 county emergency vehicles were parked on the road between my property and Karen's, their red and blue lights cutting through the dawn mist. I threw on clothes and ran outside to find firefighters spraying water on a small grass fire near the property line, a fire that had mysteriously started in the night, burning exactly the section of prairie grass visible from Karen's house. Fire Chief Rodriguez, no relation to my attorney, was examining the burn area when I approached. "Morning, Tom. Small fire, probably started around 3 a.m. Neighbor called it in. Any idea how it started?" Rodriguez pointed to a metal object half buried in the ash. "Looks like someone dropped a cigarette, or maybe a road flare. Hard to tell now." I examined the burn pattern. The fire had started in a perfect line along my property boundary and burned inland about 50 feet before the fire department arrived. It was too neat, too convenient to be accidental. "Chief, I don't smoke, and neither does anyone who works on my property." "That's what I figured." Rodriguez lowered his voice. "Between you and me, this looks deliberate. Someone wanted to create a fire exactly where it would cause the most drama." Karen appeared as if summoned by our conversation, wearing a silk robe and expensive slippers, looking appropriately concerned but not surprised. "Oh my goodness, Tom. I'm so sorry this happened to your beautiful grass." Her sympathy was Academy Award quality. I called 911 the moment I saw the flames. I was so worried it might spread to the trees or even to houses. "Thank you for calling it in," I replied evenly. "Lucky you were awake at 3 a.m. to see it." I couldn't sleep. All this stress about the property dispute, you know. She gestured toward the burned area. "I guess this proves what we've been saying about fire hazards." The setup was masterful. Karen had created exactly the emergency she'd been predicting, complete with documentation from the fire department and witnesses. Chief Rodriguez finished his report and prepared to leave. "Tom, I have to file this as a potential fire hazard. The county might require you to clear more of the grass as a precaution. Even though the fire was deliberately set. Can't prove that without an investigation, and we don't have resources for arson investigation on every grass fire." Rodriguez shook his head. "Sorry, but that's the way it works." As the fire trucks departed, Karen lingered, clearly wanting to savor her victory. "Tom, I hope you understand that I take no pleasure in this," she said with perfectly practiced sympathy. "But maybe now you'll see why some of us have been concerned about fire safety." "Oh, I see exactly what's happening here, Karen." "What do you mean?" I looked down the hill toward her house with its perfect landscaping and strategic positioning. "I mean, it's time to solve our drainage problem." Her face showed the first crack of uncertainty. Drainage problem? The natural water flow patterns that your property interferes with. I've been researching historical hydrology, and it turns out this area has some interesting seasonal characteristics. Karen's confident expression was fading. I don't know what you're talking about. You will. But what Karen didn't realize was that her fire had given me the perfect excuse to begin construction on the water management system I'd been planning. The next morning, I called Morrison Brothers Construction, a company that specialized in agricultural water systems. Jake Morrison, the owner, drove out that afternoon to survey my property. You want a fire prevention water feature? Jake studied the burned area and the natural slope of my land. Makes sense after yesterday's excitement. Exactly. Something that can provide water for fire suppression, but also manages the natural runoff from the hills above. I showed him the topographical maps I'd gotten from the Water Resources Office. I'm thinking a series of retention ponds with gravity-fed irrigation. Jake walked the property line, noting the elevation changes and natural water flow. We could build a beautiful system here. Start with a main collection pond at the highest point, then cascade down through smaller retention areas. Very natural looking, great for wildlife. How much water capacity are we talking about? With this slope and your acreage, we could easily collect and store 50,000 gallons during heavy rains. More if you want to get fancy with it. The plan was elegant. Build a water management system that would be both beautiful and functional, while dramatically altering the drainage patterns that affected Karen's property. One question, Jake said as we finished the survey. What about your downhill neighbor? This much water retention is going to change how runoff flows toward her property. That's not my problem, as long as we're not creating hazardous conditions. Oh, we're not creating anything hazardous. Just redirecting natural water flow. Jake smiled. Though I'd expect some changes in her drainage patterns during heavy rains. We started construction the following Monday. The permits were straightforward agricultural water management for fire prevention and livestock watering. The county approved the plans without hesitation. Karen appeared on my property within hours of the first excavator arriving. What is this? She demanded, pointing at the construction equipment. You can't just dig up your entire property. I'm installing a fire prevention water system, I replied calmly. Inspired by yesterday's grass fire and your concerns about safety. You're doing this to spite me. I'm doing this to protect my property and comply with fire safety recommendations. The fact that it might affect your drainage is just an unfortunate side effect. Karen's face went through several color changes as she processed the implications. This is intentional property damage. I'll sue you for everything you're worth. For building a legal water management system on my own property? Good luck with that. She stormed off, already dialing her phone. By evening, I'd received calls from her attorney, the HOA president, and someone claiming to represent the county environmental office. But the permits were legal, the construction was compliant, and Karen was about to discover what happened when you declared war on someone who understood water better than she understood suburban politics. 2 weeks of construction transformed my property into something that looked like it belonged in a nature magazine. The main collection pond sat at the highest point of my land, fed by a network of natural channels that captured runoff from the hills above. From there, water cascaded through a series of smaller ponds connected by rock-lined streams, each one designed to look like a natural water feature. The system was beautiful, functional, and completely legal. It was also going to collect and redirect approximately 80% of the water that had previously flowed directly toward Karen's property. Jake Morrison's crew had outdone themselves. The ponds were lined with native stone, planted with water-loving native plants, and designed to support local wildlife. The cascading streams created the sound of flowing water that could be heard across my entire property. "This is the most beautiful agricultural water system I've ever built," Jake told me as we watched the final pond liner being installed. "Your fire insurance company is going to love it, and it's going to be amazing for property values." What about downstream effects? Well, during normal weather, your neighbor probably won't notice much difference. But during heavy rains, Jake studied the slope toward Karen's house. Let's just say she might want to check her flood insurance. That evening, I stood on my deck, watching the sunset reflect in my new ponds, listening to the gentle sound of water flowing between them. The system wasn't just functional, it was genuinely peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped retirement would feel like. Karen's house was visible through the trees below, its perfect landscaping and dramatic architecture looking somehow smaller and more fragile from my elevated position. My phone rang around 9 p.m. It was Jim Rodriguez, my attorney. "Tom, I just got off the phone with Davidson, Klein and Associates. They're threatening emergency injunction to stop your construction project." "On what grounds?" "They claim you're intentionally creating drainage problems for surrounding properties. They want a judge to order you to cease construction until environmental impact studies can be completed." "Can they get an injunction?" "Unlikely, since you have all the proper permits and approvals. But they could tie up the project in court for months." I looked out at my nearly completed water system, then down toward Karen's house. "Jim, what happens if it rains before they get their injunction?" "Tom, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking nature doesn't wait for legal proceedings." But what I didn't tell Jim was that I'd been monitoring weather forecasts obsessively, and a major storm system was heading our way in exactly 48 hours. Friday morning dawned gray and humid, with the oppressive stillness that precedes serious weather. The National Weather Service had issued a flash flood watch for our area, predicting 2 to 4 inches of rain over 6 hours. I spent the morning making final adjustments to my water system, opening valves, and clearing debris from the channels that would direct runoff into my collection ponds. Jake Morrison had done excellent work. The system was ready to handle whatever nature could deliver. By noon, the first drops were falling, pattering against the leaves of my oak trees and creating tiny ripples in my ponds. I made coffee and settled on my covered deck to watch the show. Karen appeared at my property line around 1 p.m. wearing expensive rain gear and looking worried. "Tom," she called out through the increasing rain, "we need to talk." I walked down to meet her, noting how the water was already beginning to collect in my upper pond. "What can I do for you, Karen? This storm is going to be bad, and your construction project is going to flood my property. My fire prevention water system is designed to collect natural runoff. If that changes drainage patterns, well, that's what water does. You know exactly what you're doing." Rain was dripping from her designer hood, and her carefully maintained composure was cracking. "This is intentional, and it's malicious?" "Karen, I'm managing water flow on my own property using legal, permitted systems. If you're concerned about flooding, maybe you should check your flood insurance." "I don't have flood insurance." "This area isn't supposed to flood." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. It's not supposed to flood when artificial drainage systems divert water away from its natural collection areas. But when those systems get overwhelmed, thunder rumbled overhead and the rain intensified. I could see water beginning to flow more heavily into my collection system, exactly as designed. "You can't do this to me." "I'm not doing anything to you, Karen. I'm protecting my property from fire hazards, just like you suggested." I turned and walked back toward my house, leaving her standing in the rain. Behind me, I could hear her making frantic phone calls, but the storm was intensifying too quickly for anyone to respond. By 3 p.m., my water system was performing beautifully. The upper pond had filled to capacity and was cascading into the secondary collection areas, which were channeling overflow into the tertiary ponds. The sound of flowing water had become a constant background symphony. But what was happening downhill from my property was even more dramatic. The rain peaked around 4 p.m., coming down in sheets that turned the world gray and reduced visibility to a few hundred yards. From my deck, I could barely make out Karen's house through the downpour, but I could see something that made me smile despite the circumstances. Water was collecting in her backyard. My system was working exactly as I'd calculated. Instead of flowing directly downhill toward the creek, 80% of the storm runoff was being captured in my ponds. The remaining 20%, combined with rain falling directly on Karen's property, was overwhelming her artificial drainage systems. Her perfect lawn was disappearing under several inches of standing water. Her formal garden beds were turning into muddy marshes. The expensive outdoor lighting that illuminated her patio was sparking and going dark as water reached the electrical connections. Around 5 p.m., the rain finally began to ease. I put on my rain gear and walked down toward the property line to assess the situation. Karen's backyard had become a temporary lake. Water covered her patio, her garden paths, and most of her lawn. Her outdoor furniture was floating like little islands in the muddy water. The air filtration system she'd installed to combat my dust problem was completely submerged, its expensive HAP of filters destroyed. Most spectacularly, the concrete pad supporting her filtration system, the one that partially encroached on my property, had cracked and shifted under the water pressure, creating a small waterfall as the flood drained toward the creek. Karen appeared at her sliding glass door, staring out at her flooded paradise with an expression of absolute shock. When she saw me watching from the property line, she slid open the door and waded into the ankle-deep water on her patio. "Look what you've done," she screamed across the water. "You've destroyed everything." "I haven't destroyed anything, Karen. I just let water flow where it naturally wants to go. This is intentional. This is malicious. I'm calling the police. To report a flood caused by natural rainfall? Good luck with that." She stood there in her flooded backyard, water lapping around her expensive rain boots, surveying the damage to her perfect landscaping. The irony was beautiful. She'd spent months complaining about dust from my natural grassland, and now she was dealing with actual mud covering her entire property. But the best part was yet to come.